Hello everyone and welcome back to another problem of the day, and today's problem is titled Geek in a Maze. In this problem you are given a maze of size n cross m, and for each of the cell in the maze it is either made up of dot or an hashtag, and an empty cell is represented by a dot whereas an obstacle is represented by an hashtag. And given this, you are starting from a cell r comma c, and your task is to find how many empty cell the geek can pass through while avoiding the obstacles. And the condition they have given is that he can travel in any of the four directions, but he can move up only up u times, and he can move down only d times. So for the given example with uh, n as 3 and m as 3, that is nothing but a 3 cross 3 maze. We have our starting point as r comma c, which is 1 comma 0, which lies over here, and we also have our upward movement restricted to 1 and downward movement restricted to 1. So if I start from here and I can move up once, since my upward movement is exhausted now, I have already moved up, I cannot move up any further, and also there are no cells to move up, so I'll be moving in the either the left or the right direction. So in this case I'll move to the right direction. So after moving right n number of times, since we don't have any restrictions on the left or right movement, after moving right, I'll reach the end of this row. Then the only possible movement is going downwards. So I'll move down once. And after moving down, I'll simply come to know that I have exhausted my downward movement. And after this, I can break out of my search for empty cells. So in this way, I'll be able to traverse this cell, this, the next one to it, the next to the right, and the downward side. So thus the total number of cells that I will be able to traverse is nothing but 5. So let's take in the second example where n is 3 and m is 4. So for the second example where n is 3 and our m is 4, well, this is wrong. All right, where it's a 4 cross 3 matrix, not a 3 cross 4 matrix. We have a starting point defined as 1 comma 0, which is nothing but over here, and also we have our upward and downward movements restricted to 1 comma 2. So u is 1 and d is 2. So we can move up only once and down only 2 blocks down. So my starting point would be nothing but r comma c, which is given in the example as 1 comma 0, which points to this particular cell. Now I would be traversing this particular matrix in a BFS manner. This is because if I traverse in a DFS manner, and if I have fixed my traversal in the order of left, right, or up, down, or any order for that matter, I might end up a case. For example, if I start from this position, if I move up, then to the right, then down, down, left, left. In this case, if I traverse like this, since I will be moving left first, since there is no position to the left, I'll be moving right, then down, since there's no position up, I'll be moving down according to this traversal. And after reaching down, since I've exhausted my down, I'll be trying to move left, right, up, down from this cell, but there's no left cell, there's no upward cell since we have already visited this. Then thus the only position left to traverse is rightwards, so I'll be moving right. So if I traversed using DFS approach, I might end up a case wherein I visit all the cells, but I would miss out on those cells which I could actually traverse, meaning these two cells. And for this reason, we'll be avoiding a DFS traversal on this particular matrix, and we'll be using a BFS approach to traverse the empty cells and calculate the count of those cells. So let's say I start from this position. I'll create a queue. I'll create a queue to keep a track of the first cells and consider them in the first come first serve basis. So let's say I start from this position. Now on starting from this position, I can either traverse left, right, up, or down. So if I traverse left, there's no element, no cell to the left, so I won't be traversing to the left. I would be traversing, I'll be checking for the right position. Since to the right we have a hashtag, meaning we have a block, we won't be traversing this cell. Then we'll be traversing upwards. We can traverse upwards because we have an empty block over here. So I'll simply enter that cell value, which is nothing but 0 comma 0. Now on moving upwards, I will also check for the downward direction. Again, for the downward direction, we can move downwards because there's an empty block over here. So I'll also input its cell value, row value within a queue, which is nothing but 2 comma 0. Now whilst doing this, I'll also make a note of my upwards and downwards traversals left. So for example, if I have moved one position up, I'll only, since my movement is restricted to one in the upward direction, I would have exhausted my upward movement. So I'll have to keep a note of that accordingly. So let's say I'll have 0 comma 0 and the upward and the downward movements are represented in pairs. So my upward movement would be 0 because I've had traversed one position up, and my downward movement would be 2 because I have yet to traverse in the downward direction. And for the second cell, for the second cell which we traverse downwards, I'll have the position as 2 comma 0, and the downward and upward movement left to be 1 comma 1. This is because we have traversed one block in the downward direction. That's why we have reduced our d value and stored 1 over here. Now after moving here, since the front of the queue is represented by 0 comma 0, we'll use this cell and traverse accordingly. So let me write this down a little more clearly. Alright. Now coming to this cell, I'll mark this cell visited as and when you go. So after this cell is completed, I'll mark it as visited so that I don't come to this cell again, and that would avoid us getting inside a loop. Now after coming to this cell, I again have the option to move left, right, up and down. So I cannot move to the left, I cannot move upwards because there's no cell. Also I cannot move downwards because I've already visited that particular cell. So I'll simply be visiting the right direction, and I'll enter the cell value for this particular empty cell, which is nothing but 0 comma 1. So the cell would contain 0 comma 1. Also I have exhausted also since I'm moving to the right direction, I will not have been using the upward and the downward movement. So my upward and downward movement would remain same. It would be 0 comma 2. And since I have already visited this matrix, I'll pop it out of the queue, and I'll have incremented my answer by 1. Since this cell is also included, my answer will start from 1, and I'll have my 1 incremented for this particular cell. Now coming to again to the front of the queue, which is pointing to the cell 2 comma 0, which is present over here. I'll consider this cell again, and I'll again check for these traversals. So I cannot move to the left, I cannot move upwards because I've already visited this cell. Also I cannot move downwards because I have all because this cell block has a hashtag, meaning it has a block. So the only position left is to move to the right. So I'll take in this particular cell and push it onto the queue, and I'll increment my count for this particular cell. So the cell value for this block is nothing but 0 1 2 2 comma 1. And since I'm moving to the right, my up and downward movement would remain same as the previous block, that is 1 comma 1. And since I've visited this cell, I'll have to pop it out. Now after popping it out, I'll again consult the front of the queue. Alright, so after popping it out, I'll again consult the front of the queue, which is pointing to the cell 0 comma 1. So 0 comma 1 will take this cell. Again, I cannot move to the right. I cannot move to the left because this cell is already visited. There will be no movement in the upward direction. Also because my up is 0 and there's no cell above it. Also, I cannot move downward because there's an hashtag below. The only position left is to move to the right. So I'll enter the queue with the cell value for this particular block, which is nothing but 0 comma 3. And since I'm moving to the right direction, it won't affect my upward and downward movement, so it would remain same as the previous cell. And after doing this, I'll pop this off and increment my count. And now my front of the queue contains these values. Now I'll again consult the front of the queue, which is nothing but 2 comma 1. So 2 comma 1 is over here, and I'll again check for these movements. So I cannot move left, I cannot move upwards, I can move downwards, and I can move to the right. So I'll be moving accordingly. So let's say the right movement comes first, so I'll move to the right first. So coming here, I'll simply input its value in the queue, which is nothing but 0 comma 0, well, not 0 comma 3 but 2 comma 2, and this should be 2, my bad, this should be 2. Yeah, 2 comma 2, and the cell value would be 1 comma 1 since we are moving to the left direction, right direction, and not upwards or downwards. And after keeping a note of this, I'll simply take out this particular cell and increment my count. So my count would be now 1 2 3 4 5. Let's write it more clearly. Yeah, it would be 5 here. Alright, now after moving to this direction, I'll again check for the top of the queue, which is pointing to 0 comma 2. Now again I'll check for the left right up direction, and I can only move in the downward direction. So I'll simply push the value for this particular cell, and so from on moving downwards I'll reach this particular cell. So my queue would now contain the value 1 comma 2, and since I've moved downwards once, I'll have to decrement this downward count, and it would result in 0 comma 1. After doing this, I'll simply pop this value off and increment my count by 1. Now after doing this, again I would have to check for uh, the top of the queue, which is pointed by 2 comma 2. Again I'll have to make a check for the left right up direction, and I can move only downward direction now because upward direction has already been visited. I cannot move to the left and there's no movement to the right, so I can only move downwards. So I'll enter the cell value for this particular cell, which is nothing but 3 comma 2, and since I have moved down once, I'll have to decrement the downward count. It would become 0, and after becoming 0, I'll simply pop this value off, the front of the queue off, and I'll increment my count again. And now after incrementing my count, I'll again consult the front of the queue, which is pointed by 1 comma 2. So 1 comma 2 is here, and there's no movement left for 1 comma 2. I cannot move to the left because there's an hashtag. I cannot move to the right because there's no cell. Also, I cannot move up or down because these cells are already been visited. So I'll simply pop this queue off and I'll increment my count for that cell, which is nothing but 6 7 8. And then I'll consider this cell, which is nothing but 3 comma 2. I'll use this cell and check for its left right upward and downward movement. I cannot move upward because there's already a cell visited, and also my upward count, I still have an upward count left for this cell, and also cannot move downward, there's no cell there. Also I cannot move to the right because there's no cell there. The only left option is to move to the left, and on moving to the left I reach this cell, which is pointed by 3 comma 1, And since I'm moving to the left, I won't be using my upward and downward movement, so it would remain same. And after moving to the left, I'll simply pop this value off and increment my count, and it would become 9. Now I'll again consult the front of the queue. It is 3 comma 1, and for 3 comma 1, uh, there is no movement again in the left direction because there's an hashtag. Also to the right because the cell is already visited. Also I cannot move upward or downward because I have visited cell and no cell respectively. So I'll be simply popping this cell off and incrementing my count by 1, and I'll have my final result to be 10, which is the same as for the given example too. So let's begin with the code itself. So in order to traverse the matrix in the upward, leftward and rightward direction, I'll be making use of array dx, wherein I'll be storing our left, right and upward movement, dx and dy to be clear. So it will have 0 comma 0 minus 1 and 1, and also for dy will have minus 1 1 0 and 0. All right, now using this, if I have this 0 comma minus 1 simply represents that I'll be traversing to the left, and this 0 comma 1 simply means that I'll be traversing to the right, and this 1 minus 1 comma 0 simply means that I can traverse upwards, and 1 comma 0 accordingly means I can traverse downwards. Now also we would have to make a check if the starting position itself is a hashtag or not. So if that is the case, then we won't be able to traverse the matrix, and that's why we will have to make a check for that. So if my r comma c value is itself a hashtag, meaning we cannot go any further, I'll simply return the count to be 0. Now we'll create a visited vector of size n plus 1, and visited vector, well, a vector of vector, a boolean vector. Let's call it visited. Its size would be n plus 1 comma vector, boolean vector of size m plus 1, and we'll fill all the cell values to be false, and we'll also create a queue as discussed, and it would contain a vector wherein we'll be storing our current cell value and the count for upward and downward. So it would have uh, 4 values for each of the vector present within the queue. Let's call it queue, and initially we'll enter the queue value, first the front of the queue to be the starting cell, which is nothing but r comma c, and we'll store our upward and rightward movement to be upward and downward movement to be 0 comma 0, and we'll increment as it goes, and we'll make a check if that increment at times, if it becomes upward, if it becomes equal to u or d respectively, then we would avoid that respective movement, and we'll also initialize our count to 0, wherein we'll be storing the count of the empty cells that we can traverse. So let's begin with the loop itself. We'll move till our queue is not empty. We'll take in the front of the queue, which is nothing but a vector. Let's call it the current cell. After taking the current cell, we'll simply increment our count, and we'll mark it as visited. So the current cell is nothing but current of 0 and current of 1. So after marking it as visited, I can simply pop that particular vector off, and now we can check for its left, right and upward movement. So I'll be starting with I equal to 0, I less than 4 because we have 4 directions that we can move in. I plus plus. Now let's take in the x value, which is nothing but our I and j values respectively. So x would be current of 0 plus, since we are starting from the left direction, I'll have to increment my x value with this particular cell value, which is nothing but dx of I, and for the y value it would be current of 1 plus dy of I, and we'll take in the upward and the rightward, upward and the downward movement from our vector, which is pointed by current of 2, and the downward movement, which is pointed by current of 3. Now after taking in, we'll have to make a check if we can actually go in the upward or downward, like the respective directions, left, right, up and down. So for that, we'll check if our x value is still greater than or equal to 0 and our x is still less than n. Also, we would have to check for y if it's greater than or equal to 0 and our y is less than m. And also we'll have to check if that particular block that we are visiting pointed by xy, if it's equal to an empty block, which is nothing but the dot here. And we'll also have to check if that particular cell is already visited or not, and we'll use a visited vector for that particular check. So it would be pointed by x comma y. Now after this check is done, we'll again have to check if our upward and downward movement, if we have exhausted our upward or downward movement or not. So in that case, we'll make a check if our up is equal to u, and also for, and also if our movement here, if the considered movement that is represented by dx and dy, if it's actually upward or downward or not. So for upward, our dy value, well, not dy, our dx value would be -1. So make a check accordingly. So if dx is not equal to, is equal to -1, and we'll also make a check for the downward movement. So if our down is equal to d, it means that we have exhausted our downward movement. And we'll also have to check if we are actually moving in the downward directions. So for that, our dx of I, it should be equal to 1. If that is the case, then we'll simply continue and will not be including that particular cell. And if that is not the case, then we'll mark our visited value for x and y to be true, and we'll push that particular cell. So we'll push in the vector where x and y are the coordinates, and for the upward and downward movement left, we'll simply use the up variable, which was the previous upward count, and we'll increment its value. And for that, we'll make a check if our dx is exactly equal to -1 or not. If it is -1, then this value would be 1, because this value would be true, and we'll be incrementing our upward by 1. And similarly, if our downward movement, the current downward movement was or is 1, then we'll simply increment our downward movement by 1. After this is done, we can simply return our answer, which is nothing but represented by the variable count. Yep. Let's try and compile again. Alright, we got the right answer for the first example. Let's try and submit. Alright, so that was it for today's video. If you have any doubts or suggestions, you can ask them in the comment section, and thank you for watching.